You want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. I've written a little piece for you about the butchery that's going on in Iraq right now with the Islamic State, formerly known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Whoops, let's take the headphones out. Okay, there we go. Now, I've written this. That means I'm going to have to read it to you. So, but it's a mashup of material from my book, The Mohammed Code, which is available as an ebook on Amazon.com and is probably the only book that you can read that will let you get an x-ray, an opening into the mind of the people we call terrorists, the Islamic fighters in places like Iraq and Syria, not to mention Chechnya, Dagestan, the Xinjiang province of China, and Boko Haram in Nigeria. These Islamic groups go across a wide swath, and this book will actually help you understand what their point of view is, the Mohammed Code. Okay, let me read this to you. It's too important to just do off the top of the head. On Friday, August 15th, two events happened that made news in the following days. Both were chilling. Both were about the jihad, the holy war, being made by the Islamic State. Yes, the Islamic State, the new self-proclaimed caliphate, the military and political force formerly known as ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. One Islamic State report came from Rupert Murdoch's Sky News in Australia. It told of an attack on an unnamed Yazidi village in the north of Iraq. Who are the Yazidis? The Yazidis have a strange religion based on Zoroastrianism, Manichaeanism, Judaism, Nestorian Christianity, and Islamic beliefs. They live in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and the Caucasus areas of the Russian Federation. Yes, the Caucasus areas of the Russian Federation. Said Sky News, the unnamed Yazidi town was invaded. Then, says a man from the village next door, the Islamic State spent 5 days trying to persuade the villagers to convert to Islam. 5 days trying to get people to convert. Finally, the Islamic State folks' patience and reasonableness reached its high point. The Islamic State fighters delivered a long lecture about the subject, that is, converting to Islam, today. That was Friday. But the villagers, Friday, August 16th, but the villagers would not switch religion and become Muslims. So what did the Islamic State forces do? Says the man from the village next door, they arrived in vehicles and they started their killing this afternoon. That phrase, they started their killing this afternoon, hints that the killing took a good long time. Continues the man from the village next door, the men were gathered and shot dead. The women and girls were probably taken to Tel Afar, he says, because that is where the foreign fighters are. Foreign fighters. Fighters from England, Australia, the United States, and all over the Islamic world. They are all joining the Islamic State. The second report is also from a Rupert Murdoch outlet, The Australian. It says that, quote, the Islamic State laid siege to a village called Qacha on Friday. The Islamic State fighters eventually stormed this village in northwestern Iraq. In this incident, the Islamic State fighters killed between 300 and 400 Yazidi men and took 1,000 women and children. At this moment, it's impossible to determine whether these are reports on two separate towns or just two separate reports on the same atrocity. But here's the question. Why did the troops of the Islamic State spend 5 days trying to recruit the villagers of Qacha? And why, on the last day, did they give a final lengthy speech trying to persuade the town citizens that converting to Islam was the only reasonable thing for sane people to do? Then, when their long and patient discourse failed to convert the Yazidis, why did the Islamic State forces apparently spend hours either shooting or sawing off the heads of 300 men and take 1,000 women and children captive as sex slaves. Where does this sex slavery come from? Boko Haram in Nigeria have done it too. They have between 200 and 350 girls that they have taken and said that they will use as sex slaves or will sell off for sex slavery. Where in the world does this bizarre and barbarian notion come from? The answer is simple. The Islamic State is following the example of Muhammad. That's right, Muhammad, the one true prophet, the prophet on whose words all of Islam is based. Holiness, righteousness, and decency in militant, jihadist Muslim culture is based on the example set by Muhammad. According to one of Muhammad's many Islamic biographers, quote, sincerely tread the footsteps of Allah's final messenger Muhammad. Observe his glorious actions and attitudes, and most important of all, follow them as the faithful among his companions did. Another Islamic biographer titles his book, The Last Prophet Muhammad, a model for all time. And today's Muslim biographers agree that Muhammad is not just a paragon whose actions Muslims should imitate. Muhammad, they agree, is a model of virtue for you and me. But Muhammad was not a prophet of peace. Far from it. Says the founding father of today's Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini, quote, the leaders of our religion were all soldiers, commanders, and warriors. They killed, close quote. Muhammad called himself by many names. One of those was Nabiyu Malhama, the prophet of war. Muhammad's followers have also praised him as he who was sent with the sword, and Muhammad the Conqueror. Muhammad the Conqueror was the favorite phrase of Osama bin Laden. Your brothers at Azam Publications, an extremist website that went into hiding on September 11th, 2001, also point out with pride that Muhammad was a man who used weapons and went into battle, a man who killed. And these extremists are right. Muhammad's kill the men and take the women as sex slave strategy started in 624 AD, 1,390 years ago. That's when Allah told Muhammad that he and his followers have permission to wage jihad, to crusade, to make holy war. Muhammad said that terror, killing, and trickery would be jihad's three basic tools. And Allah backed him up. Said Allah in the blessed book, the Quran, I will instill terror into the hearts of the unbelievers, smite ye above their necks, which means decapitate them, and smite all their fingertips off them. That is, mutilate their bodies, whether they are dead or still alive. Slay the pagans, says the Quran, wherever ye find them, and seize them, beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war. In the next 8 years, Muhammad commanded 65 military campaigns. As your brothers at Azam said with pride, he personally led 27 of them. Muhammad was particularly enthusiastic about attacking towns of Jews, in all probability because they were wealthy and they were too weak to defend themselves. In 627 AD, Muhammad set the pattern that the Islamic State's troops would follow 1,387 years later in the northern Iraqi town of Qacha. Muhammad got the ball rolling by telling his followers that the Jews were, quote, a people without understanding, transformed into apes and swine, racing each other in sin and rancor. Evil indeed are their works. That's the quote from Muhammad. The prophet added that in fact Islam's very ability to affect history would depend on a slaughter of Hebrews. The hour will not be established, he said, until you fight with the Jews and stone behind, and every stone, wait a minute, the hour will not be established, he said, until you fight with the Jews, and the stone behind which a Jew will be hiding will say, O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, so please kill him. Muhammad had just won a battle against his archenemies, the Meccans, when this all began. But that battle had been a siege of the town that Muhammad had turned into his headquarters, Medina. When the Meccans, his enemies, gave up and went back home, Muhammad had come out on top. He'd won. But he had a problem. There was no loot. There was no booty. There was no treasure to divvy up. There were no corpses over which men could crow about their bravery. And loot and glory were the rewards with which Muhammad kept the loyalty of his men. So his victory left Muhammad with a problem. How do you keep your soldiers motivated? When the battle was over, Muhammad went to the house of one of his wives to wash up. He laid down his arms and took a bath. Then Allah, the most benevolent, the most merciful, came up with a solution to the motivation problem. Allah sent a figure in an embroidered gold turban riding up to the house where Muhammad was cleaning up. The visitor, on a white mule with a brocade-covered saddle, was the angel Gabriel, who the prophet said had told him to stop lazing around, to put his armor back on, and to attack the richest people in the neighborhood, a town of Jewish leather specialists called the Banu Qurayza. As an added incentive, Gabriel promised that I too will attack the Jews and shake them out of their homes. To show how deeply Allah was committed to this assault, Muhammad said that God had promised to augment the Muslim forces with a troop of armed angels. Muhammad ordered his soldiers to gather together and to stride off on a fast march with no time out even for the obligatory afternoon Muslim prayer session. In addition, say the Hadith, holy books of Islam that record just about everything that anybody was able to remember about Muhammad within 200 years of his death. That's the Hadith. And according to the Hadith, the dust rose in the streets of Medina as Gabriel's regiment, the promised regiment of killer angels, marched through town. When the combined force of men and angels approached the fortifications of the Jewish village, the angel Gabriel rode out ahead of the vanguard, still on his white mule with a brocade-covered saddle, to shake their fortresses and cast terror into their lives. Then came Muhammad's turn. Ibn Ishaq is one of the first, the greatest, and the most thorough Muslim biographers of Muhammad. He was a devout Muslim, writing in the 8th century, a mere 120 years after Muhammad's death. Explains Ibn Ishaq, quote, "The messenger approached the Jews and said, 'You brothers of monkeys, has God disgraced you and brought his vengeance upon you?' They replied, 'O Muhammad, you are not a barbarous person.' Muhammad did his best to prove the Jews wrong. He opened a 25-day siege of the Banu Qurayza's village, and he was barbaric. This is where Muhammad's brilliance as a leader comes in handy. It's difficult to outlast an enemy in a siege. It's tough when you're surrounding someone, your prey, and when you're separated by who are your prey, and you're separated by walls, and when the open landscape constantly tempts your forces to give up and go home. Poorly disciplined troops are likely to cut and run, but Muhammad made discipline central to his belief system. 5 times a day, Muslims were required to get together in a group, get down on their knees, bow down to the ground, and pray. That's what historian William McNeill calls muscular bonding. So Muhammad's warriors, who were schooled in absolute submission, that's what Islam means, who were schooled in absolute obedience and coordinated effort, were prepped for lengthy military struggles by Muhammad's belief system. They could outlast those they chose to attack. Outlasting the Jews worked wonders. Says Ibn Ishaq, God cast terror into their hearts. They felt sure that the apostle would not leave them until he had made an end of them. After a night in which the women and children wept from dusk until daylight, the Jews decided to surrender to the apostles' judgment and threw themselves on Muhammad's mercy. A tribe of Muslims with close ties to the Jews asked Muhammad to do what he had done for other Jewish tribes that he'd attacked: spare the Jews' lives and settle for a simple ethnic cleansing. This seemed logical for a prophet who insisted that he spoke in the name of Allah the Merciful, Allah the Compassionate. But this is not how Muhammad, the paragon of Islamic, quote, clemency, love, and kindness, handled the lives that Allah had placed in his hands. According to one biographer, Muhammad Haikal, Muhammad had concluded before the war even began that, quote, the Banu Qurayza must be completely destroyed. The result was what 8th century biographer Ibn Ishaq calls a massacre. Explains Ishaq, the Jews of the Banu Qurayza surrendered, and the apostle confined them in Mecca. Then the apostle went out to the market of Medina. Wait a minute, confined them in Medina, not Mecca. Then the apostle went out to the market of Medina, which is still its market today, and dug trenches in it. Then he sent for them, the Jewish captives, and struck off their heads in those trenches, as they were brought out to him in batches. There were 600 or 700 in all, though some put the figure as high as 800 or 900. As they were being taken out in batches to the apostle, they asked their leader, this is all the words of Ibn Ishaq, what he thought would be done with them. He replied, will you never understand? Don't you see that the summoner never stops, and those who are taken do not return? By Allah, it is death. This went on until the apostle made an end of them. That's the close of Ibn Ishaq's words. Worry not. Muhammad did not soil his own hands with the neck slicing. He sat down. This is another early biographer of Muhammad, another august biographer of Muhammad, a Muslim named Al-Tabari, who wrote a 32-volume history of Muhammad and the birth of the Islamic nation. He sat down, says Al-Tabari, and Ali and Al-Zubayr began cutting off their heads in his presence. Some of the wives, mothers, and sisters of these captives apparently were forced to watch the head chopping. Says Muhammad's favorite wife, Aisha, only one of their women was killed. She was actually with me, and was talking with me, and laughing immoderately, as the apostle was killing her men in the market, when suddenly an unseen voice called her name. Good heavens, I cried, what is the matter? I am to be killed, she replied. She was taken away and beheaded. I shall never forget my wonder at her good spirits and her loud laughter, but all the time she knew that she would be killed. Then, says Ibn Ishaq, came the goodies, the loot, the booty. Muhammad, quote, was a very sea of generosity to us. Those are Ibn Ishaq's words. More of Ibn Ishaq's words. The Prophet divided the wealth, wives, and children of the Banu Qurayza Jews among the Muslims. Boasted one of the Muslim warriors who partook of the spoils, war has left us the best gift of our bounteous Lord. High white forts and resting places for camels, where palms are black and milk is plentiful, and horses swift as wolves, now guarding the tribesmen's cattle, now slaying the enemy, and returning with the spoil. No wonder the Quran calls the mass murder of the Banu Qurayza and its aftermath the epitome of Allah's generosity, his kindness to the Muslims. Quote, with Allah are profits and spoils abundant, close quote. Yes, indeed. What's more, one of the Muslim warriors bragged something very new in his rap-like poetry like rap music, after the defeat of the Banu Qurayza Jews. We have a prophet, a true helper, by whom we can conquer all men. 2 decades later, those words would take on more meaning than the man who uttered them could possibly have imagined. The tale of the victory over the Banu Qurayza, told by one of Islam's most revered sources, the Hadith, and by the Muslim biographers, rapidly turns sexual. Says Muhammad Haikal, a mainstream Muslim 20th century biographer, quote, the messenger of God selected for himself from the women of the slaughtered Jews a choice beauty, Rayhana, and she remained his concubine for the rest of his life. How willing, do you think, she was to be fucked by Muhammad? The rest of the captured women and children were given out as slaves to the others who had, quote, fought in the way of Allah. This was one of many victories in which Allah saved his best sex prizes for Muhammad, a man with a strong carnal appetite. Muhammad coupled with women of all ages, but the holy books of Islam, the Hadith, explain that he had a special, quote, liking for the virgins and for fondling them, close quote, and for, quote, a young girl so that you might play with her and she with you." Close quote. Allah was extraordinarily open-handed in the sexual gifts he showered on Muhammad. "O Prophet," says the Quran, "we have made lawful to thee thy wives to whom thou hast paid their dowers, and those whom thy right hand possesses, out of the prisoners of war, whom Allah has assigned to thee, and daughters of thy paternal uncles and aunts, and daughters of thy maternal uncles and aunts who migrated from Mecca with thee, and any believing woman who dedicates her soul to the Prophet, if the Prophet wishes to wed her. This only for thee, and not for the believers at large." How kind. Note the phrase, "those whom thy right hand possesses." Possessing captives with the right hand is a code phrase for rape or sex by any means of force possible. Since every child begotten by sex imposed on a sexual plaything, a slave girl, must be raised knowing the truth of Islam, this form of sexual abuse was considered a legitimate way to spread the truth of Allah. As modern Islamic historian Ali Mazrui, who actually had a 12-part series on PBS, puts it, Islam's, quote, "culture of procreation is a strategy for multiplying in the name of Allah. Procreation itself, sex, says Ali Mazrui, quote, can be counted as a form of jihad. Rape can be counted as a form of jihad, a way to spread the one true word of God." Adds Mazrui, the Muslim Ummah, the global community of Muslims, is allowed to expand by divine intervention and by biological impregnation. In other words, forced sex is a legitimate way to spread a belief, a religion, a vision, and a way of life. War, its spoils, its sexual rewards, and divvying them up would become so fundamental to militant Islam that the Quran has an entire chapter on the subject. Chapter 8. It's called The Spoils of War, the booty. That chapter is based in large part on the example Muhammad himself set after the murder of the Banu Qurayza. Even those who died fighting in the way of Allah were showered with sexual prizes. They were showered with what Usama Kayat, author of The Virtues of Martyrdom, calls the famous, quote, 72 women of paradise, close quote. That is Usama Kayat's quote. And he goes on to say that they are so beautiful, pure, and transparent that the marrow of the bones of their legs will be seen through the bones and flesh. Something you see, a quote you see recurring over and over again in the Hadith. To repeat one of militant Islam's most potent slogans, quote, "With Allah, our Prophet, and spoils abundant." Yes, spoils. The loot of war, the profit of mass murder, the privilege of rape. There's one more reason that Muslim militants, like the good folks of modern Iraq and Syria's Islamic State, video, cell phone, Twitter, and website their worst atrocities. Muhammad recommended conquering by instilling sheer shit-in-your-pants terror. Beheading the Banu Qurayza advertised militant Islam's ruthlessness, and the fear of that ruthlessness inspired the people of Mecca to surrender and to let Muhammad take over their city without a fight. The city that had been Muhammad's biggest enemy, Mecca, was now Muhammad's. Muhammad's to rule. Today, the Islamic State may be repeating the same tactic, slaughtering village members one by one in northern Iraq, shooting them or sawing off their heads while the victims scream, grimace, and beg, then posting the videotape online. Why? To convince Baghdad, Iraq's capital, to surrender without a fight. First Baghdad, then America. This is Howard the Humongous, speaking to you from the future. It's your job, or my job, to make. And now for the off button, which is more cleverly hidden than ever before because it's somewhere on the laptop sitting on my lap. Let's see if we can find it. Hang on, bear with me. There, I found it. The off button.